This is the history of spaceflight and space technology. I'm Andrew Chaikin. This is week 3, Mercury and Vostok. After the tremendous success of Alan Shepard's suborbital flight, which finally got the United States into the manned space race, they followed up with a second suborbital mission, basically a repeat of Shepard's flight by Gus Grissom. It took place on July 21st, 1961, and was also a great success. Grissom rode the Redstone booster up to a height similar to Shepard's, 115 miles or so, and splashed down safely in the Atlantic. But then things started to go wrong for reasons that have yet to this day not been fully explained. The explosive detonator on Grissom's hatch, the side hatch of his Mercury capsule, blew off prematurely as Grissom was lying in his couch waiting for the recovery helicopter. At that point, seawater began to flood the interior of the capsule. Grissom scrambled out of the spacecraft and was floating in the Atlantic while the recovery helicopters arrived. One of the copters tried unsuccessfully to save the flooded spacecraft with a tow line that it was trying to raise it up out of the water, but the weight was just too much for the helicopter's engines. And Grissom, meanwhile, was being pushed under the water by the downwash of the other helicopters, and almost had a narrow escape of almost drowning, and was plucked from the sea safely, a little bit shaken up, and he lost his spacecraft, which you can see in the right-hand picture, rested at the bottom of the ocean for many years. It was called Liberty Bell 7, and it wasn't until 1999 that very enterprising and determined researcher named Kurt Newport had located the spacecraft and had an expedition to actually raise it from a couple of thousand feet down in the bottom of the Atlantic, and it's now on display. Grissom's flight was overall a great success and convinced NASA that they did not need to do any more suborbital Mercury flights. However, on the heels of Grissom's success, the Russians upped the ante with another Vostok flight. Vostok 2 took place on August 6th and 7th of 1961. Cosmonaut German Titov was aloft for an entire day, made 17 orbits. You can see the chart shows just the first 12 hours of that flight and some of the events from the mission as he went through many orbits. Became the first human being to sleep in space. He was also the first person to experience what today is a very well-known and recognized phenomenon of space adaptation syndrome, specifically motion sickness brought on by the body's response to weightlessness. Turns out that when you go up in space, roughly half of the people who do go into space experience some form of adaptation syndrome, which can include nausea and headache, and usually goes away after a day or so. But of course, in Titov's case, it was not until the next morning, after he slept for a good 8 hours, that he woke up and felt much better. He did land successfully on August 7th, and you can see a headline in one of the American newspapers. And what I find noteworthy is the subheading that says, "Can U.S. still win race to moon?" And of course, the fact that the Russians had put up one person for a single orbit in the case of Gagarin, and then a second cosmonaut for an entire day. Those were certainly great achievements, but they didn't really point to the capability of doing anything beyond low Earth orbit. But such was the state of the American psychology that at that time it seemed like the Russians were just miles and miles ahead of us, which they were, but it wouldn't be too terribly long before we caught up. Well, on February 20th, 1962, we finally had our own successful orbital flight, a name that is still, to this day, one of the most famous names in American history. John Glenn made 3 orbits in his Friendship 7 Mercury capsule. He, of course, launched atop the more powerful Atlas booster you can see there, lifting off from Cape Canaveral. And on the right, notice the crowd of people that is absolutely jammed into New York's Grand Central Station, where they have a big television screen showing live coverage of the launch. CBS News for Glenn in orbit. I think that picture captures as much as anything the fact that this program, this succession of flights called Project Mercury, truly grabbed the national attention and was a matter of national importance. Well, Glenn's flight went very, very well. It lasted about 5 hours. That's about how long he was aloft, how long he was in orbit. But until the 3rd orbit, when some things started to go wrong, specifically, there was an indication in the telemetry from Glenn's spacecraft to Mission Control in Houston that there might be a problem with a portion of his reentry and landing device, system called the landing bag. And this is, in fact, a cloth bag that is supposed to unfurl as the spacecraft descends to the water on its parachute. So this is after reentry. The heat shield would actually separate during the last couple of 100 feet of the descent. And, I'm not sure of that figure. It's a guess. But roughly the last part of the descent. And that cloth bag would fill with air as it unraveled and the heat shield weighed it down. And then as it hit the water, it would act like a cushion to help cushion the impact on the water. Well, the indication was that maybe Glenn's landing bag had deployed prematurely. And so they were very worried about that. It turned out that was a false alarm, but we didn't know that. Nobody knew that at the time. And you can see the indication at left, the illustration at the lower left of what they thought might be the situation. If he let go of his retropack, the landing bag would release the heat shield, and then he would re-enter with an obviously fatal situation. The heat shield would no longer be firmly attached to the bottom of the spacecraft and would not protect him from re-entry heating. They told him to keep the retropack attached so that the straps holding the retropack onto the heat shield would keep the landing bag from separating. He did so, and he re-entered the atmosphere, and the retropack burning off created just an amazing amount of flame and glowing material streaking past his windows. And as he regained contact with Mission Control, they said, "How are you doing?" He said, "My condition is good, but that was a real fireball."